This is Chapter 58 of Pride and Prejudice, or Chapter 16 of Volume 3. Instead of receiving any such letter of excuse from his friend as Elizabeth half expected Mr. Bingley to do, he was able to bring Darcy with him to Longbourn before many days had passed after Lady Catherine's visit. The gentleman arrived early, and before Mrs. Bennet had time to tell him of their having seen his aunt, of which her daughter sat in momentary dread, Bingley, who wanted to be alone with Jane, proposed their all walking out. It was agreed to. Mrs. Bennet was not in the habit of walking. Mary could never spare time, but the remaining 5 set off together. Bingley and Jane, however, soon allowed the others to outstrip them. They lagged behind, while Elizabeth, Kitty, and Darcy were to entertain each other. Very little was said by either. Kitty was too much afraid of him to talk. Elizabeth was secretly forming a desperate resolution, and perhaps he might be doing the same. They walked towards the Lucases because Kitty wished to call upon Maria, and as Elizabeth saw no occasion for making it a general concern, when Kitty left them, she went boldly on with him alone. Now was the moment for her resolution to be executed, and while her courage was high, she immediately said, "Mr. Darcy, I am a very selfish creature, and for the sake of giving relief to my own feelings, care not how much I may be wounding yours. I can no longer help thanking you for your unexampled kindness to my poor sister. Ever since I have known it, I have been most anxious to acknowledge to you how gratefully I feel it. Were it known to the rest of my family, I should not have merely my own gratitude to express." So that's Elizabeth's desperate resolution that she tells Mr. Darcy that she's so grateful that he helped Lydia and made sure that Wickham married her. "I am sorry, exceedingly sorry," replied Darcy, in a tone of surprise and emotion, "that you have ever been informed of what may, in a mistaken light, have given you uneasiness. I did not think Mrs. Gardiner was so little to be trusted." "You must not blame my aunt. Lydia's thoughtlessness first betrayed to me that you had been concerned in the matter, and, of course, I could not rest till I knew the particulars. Let me thank you again and again, in the name of all my family, for that generous compassion which induced you to take so much trouble, and bear so many mortifications, for the sake of discovering them." So Mr. Darcy says that he's sorry that Elizabeth found out about it and was surprised that Mrs. Gardiner told her. Elizabeth said, no, it was Kitty who first tipped her off to this. She feels bad that Mr. Darcy had to go through so much, bear so many mortifications to find them, because of course I'm sure he was reminded of the incident with Wickham trying to elope with Georgiana. "If you will thank me," he replied, "let it be for yourself alone. That the wish of giving happiness to you might add force to the other inducements which led me on, I shall not attempt to deny. But your family owe me nothing. Much as I respect them, I believe I thought only of you." So Mr. Darcy admits that making Elizabeth happy was one of his key motivations. The other inducements which he's talking about is the fact really that he knew Wickham was not a reputable person and could pull a stunt like this, and that he did not share with anyone that Wickham wasn't to be trusted. Elizabeth was too much embarrassed to say a word. After a short pause, her companion added, "You are too generous to trifle with me. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on this subject forever." So he tells Elizabeth that he feels the same as when he proposed last April, and that if she still feels the same way about him, i.e. hating him, if she just says no, he will never bring up the fact that he's in love with her again. Elizabeth, feeling all the more than common awkwardness and anxiety of his situation, now forced herself to speak, and immediately, though not very fluently, gave him to understand that her sentiments had undergone so material a change since the period to which he alluded as to make her receive with gratitude and pleasure his present assurances. The happiness which this reply produced was such as he had probably never felt before, and he expressed himself on the occasion as sensibly and as warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to do. Had Elizabeth been able to encounter his eyes, she might have seen how well the expression of heartfelt delight diffused over his face became him. But though she could not look, she could listen, and he told her feelings which, in proving of what importance she was to him, made his affection every moment more valuable. So Elizabeth tells him that her feelings have completely changed since he proposed to her, and that she does love him in return, and then he tells her that he loves her and gives more details. They walked on without knowing in what direction. There was too much to be thought and felt and said for attention to any other objects. She soon learnt that they were indebted for their present good understanding to the efforts of his aunt, who did call on him in her return through London, and there relate her journey to Longbourn, its motive, and the substance of her conversation with Elizabeth, dwelling emphatically on every expression of the latter, which, in her ladyship's apprehension, peculiarly denoted her perverseness and assurance in the belief that such a relation must assist her endeavours to obtain that promise from her nephew which she had refused to give. But, unluckily for her ladyship, its effect had been exactly contrariwise. So Lady Catherine did go to Mr. Darcy after she spoke with Elizabeth, told him exactly what she went to speak to Elizabeth about, and she wanted Mr. Darcy to say that he would not propose. Mr. Darcy did not say that, and in fact, Lady Catherine de Bourgh going to him and telling him that Elizabeth was kind of dodgy and said, I'm not going to never say that I'll marry Mr. Darcy. The fact that he knows all that makes him feel comfortable saying that he loves her here in this chapter. It taught me to hope, said he, as I had scarcely ever allowed myself to hope before. I knew enough of your disposition to be certain that had you been absolutely, irrevocably decided against me, you would have acknowledged it to Lady Catherine frankly and openly. Elizabeth colored and laughed as she replied, Yes, you know enough of my frankness to believe me capable of that. After abusing you so abominably to your face, I could have no scruple in abusing you to all your relations. So Elizabeth says, yes, that he's right. If she had not wanted to marry him, she would have told Lady Catherine de Bourgh up front, no, I don't want to marry him at all. What did you say of me that I did not deserve? For though your accusations were ill-founded, formed on mistaken premises, my behavior to you at the time had merited the severest reproof. It was unpardonable. I cannot think of it without abhorrence. So Mr. Darcy is now admitting that he made a lot of serious mistakes in the past, and that although some of Elizabeth's opinions came from mistaken information, think about the whole Wickham situation, that he did behave horribly to her, and he recognizes that he was very proud and rude. We will not quarrel for the greater share of blame annexed to that evening, said Elizabeth. The conduct of neither, if strictly examined, will be irreproachable. But since then we have both, I hope, improved in civility. I cannot be so easily reconciled to myself. The recollection of what I then said, of my conduct, my manners, my expressions during the whole of it, is now, and has been many months, inexpressibly painful to me. Your reproof, so well applied, I shall never forget. Had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner, those were your words. You know not, you can scarcely conceive, how they have tortured me, though it was some time, I confess, before I was reasonable enough to allow their justice. So apparently it took time for Mr. Darcy to not to understand, but for him to really take in what Elizabeth said and believe it, but he did listen to her and has really changed his personality. I was certainly very far from expecting them to make so strong an impression. I had not the smallest idea of their being ever felt in such a way. I can easily believe it. You thought me then devoid of every proper feeling. I am sure you did. The turn of your countenance I shall never forget, as you said that I could not have addressed you in any possible way that would induce you to accept me. Oh, do not repeat what I then said. These recollections will not do it all. I assure you that I have long been most heartily ashamed of it. Darcy mentioned his letter. Did it, said he, did it soon make you think better of me? Did you, on reading it, give any credit to its contents? She explained what its effect on her had been, and how gradually all her former prejudices had been removed. I knew, said he, that what I wrote must give you pain, but it was necessary. I hope you have destroyed the letter. There was one part, especially the opening of it, which I should dread your having the power of reading again. I can remember some expressions which might justly make you hate me. The opening of that letter is not the best part of it. He hasn't quite explained himself at that point, and it doesn't have very kind expressions. The letter shall certainly be burnt if you believe it essential to the preservation of my regard. But, though we have both reason to think my opinion is not entirely unalterable, they are not, I hope, quite so easily changed as that implies. When I wrote that letter, replied Darcy, I believed myself perfectly calm and cool, but I am since convinced that it was written in a dreadful bitterness of spirit. The letter perhaps began in bitterness, but it did not end so. The adieu is charity itself, but think no more of the letter. The feelings of the person who wrote and the person who received it are now so widely different from what they were then, that every unpleasant circumstance attending it ought to be forgotten. You must learn some of my philosophy. Think only of the past as its remembrance gives you pleasure. I cannot give you credit for any philosophy of the kind. Your retrospections must be so totally void of reproach, that the contentment arising from them is not of philosophy, but, what is much better, of ignorance. But with me it is not so. Painful recollections will intrude, which ought not to be repelled. I have been a selfish being all my life in practice, though not in principle. As a child, I was taught what was right, but I was not taught to correct my temper. I was given good principles, but left to follow them in pride and conceit. Unfortunately, an only son, for many years an only child, I was spoiled by my parents, who, though good themselves, my father particularly, all that was benevolent and amiable, allowed, encouraged, almost taught me to be selfish and overbearing, to care for none beyond my own family circle, to think meanly of all the rest of the world, to wish at least to think meanly of their sense and worth compared with my own. Such I was from 8 to 28, and such I might still have been but for you, dearest, loveliest Elizabeth. What do I not owe you? You taught me a lesson, hard indeed at first, but most advantageous. By you I was properly humbled. I came to you without a doubt of my reception. You showed me how insufficient were all my pretensions to please a woman worthy of being pleased. I think this is one of the longest speeches that Mr. Darcy gives, but he really admits fault and takes blame and responsibility for what he's done. He says that Elizabeth, when looking back, her retrospections must be so totally void of reproach that the contentment arising from them is not a philosophy, but what is much better of ignorance. So if Elizabeth looks back at her past actions, she would see that she didn't know certain circumstances and that she otherwise behaved in an acceptable manner. But he looks back and he sees that he behaved really wrongly, not because he didn't know things, but because he was very proud and conceited. And he admits that he knew right from wrong, and was raised to know right from wrong, but that he was never taught to control his temper. So he's taking responsibility for some of the flaws that he has. And he says that she's also taught him a lesson, which was not easy to learn, but that he's really been humbled by her. So if you think about pride and humility, they're opposites. So he's a very different character than the one who made his first proposal. Had you then persuaded yourself that I should? I'll read the last sentence. You showed me how insufficient were all my pretensions to please a woman worthy of being pleased. Had you then persuaded yourself that I should? Indeed I had. What will you think of my vanity? I believed you to be wishing, expecting my addresses. My manners must have been in fault, but not intentionally. I assure you, I never meant to deceive you, but my spirits might often lead me wrong. How you must have hated me after that evening. Hate you? I was angry perhaps at first, but my anger soon began to take a proper direction. I am almost afraid of asking you what you thought of me when we met at Pemberley. You blamed me for coming? No, indeed, I felt nothing but surprise. Your surprise cannot be greater than mine in being noticed by you. My conscience told me that I deserved no extraordinary politeness, and I confess that I did not expect to receive more than my due. My object then, replied Darcy, was to show you, by every civility in my power, that I was not so mean as to resent the past, and I hope to obtain your forgiveness to lessen your ill opinion, by letting you see that your proofs have been attended to. How soon any other wishes introduced themselves I can hardly tell, but I believe in about half an hour after I had seen you. So Mr. Darcy says that he was surprised to see Elizabeth at Pemberley, so she asks if he blamed her for coming. He says no, that he was just surprised, and that his first goal was to show Elizabeth that he had changed and taken her advice into consideration and changed his prideful manners and to be kind and civil and polite. But then after that, about half an hour later, he starts thinking about how he does love her. He then told her of Georgiana's delight in her acquaintance and of her disappointment at its sudden interruption, which naturally leading to the cause of that interruption, she soon learnt that his resolution of following her from Derbyshire in quest of her sister had been formed before he quitted the inn, and that his gravity and thoughtfulness there had arisen from no other struggles than what such a purpose must comprehend. So now he tells her that Georgiana was grateful to have Elizabeth as a friend and to meet her, and then he says, to her sudden disappointment at its interruption, which naturally led to the cause of that interruption, she soon learnt that his resolution of following her from Derbyshire in quest of her sister, etc., etc. So the interruption with Georgiana knowing Elizabeth is, of course, the Wickham-Lydia eloping situation, and he says that as he was leaving the inn, he had already made up his mind to go follow Wickham and Lydia to London and find out where they were, and that he was very quiet there, not because he was thinking about how much he doesn't like her at this point and how he'd never have Wickham for a brother-in-law, but he was thinking instead of how he seriously has to go find them, search them out, and how unpleasant that will be. So that explains his change of demeanor to a grave and distressed when he was back at the inn learning of the situation. She expressed her gratitude again, but it was too painful a subject to each to be dwelt on farther. After walking several miles in a leisurely manner, and too busy to know anything about it, they found at last, on examining their watches, that it was time to be at home. What could have become of Mr. Bingley and Jane was a wonder which introduced the discussion of their affairs. Darcy was delighted with their engagement. His friend had given him the earliest information of it. "I must ask whether you were surprised," said Elizabeth. Not at all. When I went away, I felt that it would soon happen. That is to say, you had given your permission. I guessed as much." And though he exclaimed at the term, she found that it had been pretty much the case. So apparently Mr. Darcy did essentially give Bingley permission to go and ask Jane to marry him. "On the evening before my going to London," said he, "I made a confession to him, which I believe I ought to have made long ago. I told him of all that had occurred to make my former interference in his affairs absurd and impertinent. His surprise was great. He had never had the slightest suspicion. I told him, moreover, that I believed myself mistaken in supposing, as I had done, that your sister was indifferent to him. And as I could easily perceive that his attachment to her was unabated, I felt no doubt in their happiness together." So there, Mr. Darcy's not necessarily saying that he gave permission, but he confessed to Bingley how he had interfered and said that he believed Jane to have been indifferent to him, but that he was mistaken and that Jane does really care about him. Darcy was confident that Mr. Bingley's affection was unabated, so that it never stopped, that Bingley never stopped loving Jane, so Mr. Darcy was pretty sure that the whole thing would work itself out. Elizabeth could not help smiling at his easy manner of directing his friend. "Did you speak from your own observation," said she, "when you told him that my sister loved him, or merely from my information last spring?" "From the former." So Mr. Darcy tells Bingley, not that Elizabeth says Jane loves him, but Mr. Darcy says that by observing Jane and Bingley together, he did decide that Jane was being sincere. "From the former. I had narrowly observed her during the 2 visits which I had lately made here, and I was convinced of her affection." So not even Darcy observing them in the past, but observing Bingley and Jane when they were all sitting together very recently when Mr. Bingley came back to Netherfield. And if you remember from a couple of chapters ago, Mr. Darcy is very quiet and Elizabeth keeps wanting him to talk to her and figure out where they're at. But Mr. Darcy keeps looking at Jane, and that's why he's trying to figure out if Jane sincerely does like Bingley from his own observation. "And your assurance of it, I suppose, carried immediate conviction to him." "It did. Bingley is most unaffectedly modest. His diffidence had prevented his depending on his own judgment in so anxious a case, but his reliance on mine made everything easy. I was obliged to confess one thing, which for a time, and not unjustly, offended him. I could not allow myself to conceal that your sister had been in town 3 months last winter, that I had known it and purposely kept it from him. He was angry, but his anger, I am persuaded, lasted no longer than he remained in any doubt of your sister's sentiments. He has heartily forgiven me now." So Darcy also tells us that Bingley is most unaffectedly modest. His diffidence, so his respect for authority, had prevented his depending on his own judgment in so anxious a case. So Mr. Bingley is very humble and is not confident that he could win Jane over. But when Mr. Darcy confirmed that Jane did like him, that kind of encouraged him to really propose. Darcy also says that he tells Bingley that he concealed the fact that Jane was in London from him, and that Bingley was mad for a while, and then when Bingley realized that Jane had genuine feelings for him, his anger was just gone, because it's such a happy thing to find out. Elizabeth longed to observe that Mr. Bingley had been a most delightful friend, so easily guided that his worth was invaluable, but she checked herself. She remembered that he had yet to learn to be laughed at, and it was rather too early to begin. In anticipating the happiness of Bingley, which of course was to be inferior only to his own, he continued the conversation till they reached the house. In the hall they parted. So Elizabeth wants to make a joke that Bingley's a really good friend and such a delightful friend to have because he can be so easily led, but then she remembers that Mr. Darcy does not have quite her sense of humor, her lively sense of humor, so she withholds from making the joke at the end of the chapter, and Mr. Darcy is anticipating, so looking forward to Bingley and Jane being happily married, and Bingley's happiness is only going to be second to Mr. Darcy's happiness. That Now, Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth are an item. And that's chapter 58.